we go. And this recording, like I said, will be shared with students. And before we begin, I do want to take a moment to situate myself on the land that I'm currently occupying. I've been an uninvited guest on the stolen and ancestral lands of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish for about 6 years now. I interact with this land and with this space as a mixed race, queer Central American settler who is half white and who is half Black. And I also know and want to recognize that a land acknowledgement on its own isn't enough. And we must, as organizations, as communities, and as individuals, take action to help fight against the ongoing violence that Indigenous communities face and dismantle the systems of repression that have led to ongoing and global anti-Blackness as well. And we also have to be perfectly clear for this event: climate justice is racial justice. There is no climate justice without Indigenous sovereignty, and there is no climate justice without Black liberation. And to also be perfectly clear, settler colonial nations like Canada are built on the stolen land and stolen bodies as well. We need to hold ourselves accountable and recognize how our place on this land maintains colonial dynamics in Canada, or what is now known as Canada. We have a responsibility to unlearn harmful ideologies and understand the connection between the settler colonial state and their institutions and the acceleration of climate change. And we have known that Indigenous and Black communities have been rising up against these systems of oppression that are deeply rooted in colonialism and violence for hundreds of years. We want to remind everyone that we must take an intersectional approach to addressing these issues. And we hope that this is something that folks keep in mind as we engage in this content today, but also take this understanding with us moving forward in everything we do. And next up, I will pass it to the Black Student Union, to Melanie, to introduce themselves and the event a little bit more.
Hi everyone, so I'm Melanie and I'm in my 3rd year here at UBC and I'm the current VP External at the BSU. So for those of you who don't know, the UBC Black Student Union was founded in 2018 and our goal was to create a space where Black students at the university could come together to form a community in a safe and welcoming environment. So we're a student-led club and we strive to be a unanimous voice for Black students on and off campus. I'm going to pass it back to Adriana, who's kind of going to talk about what herself and then what the Climate Hub do.
Thank you for that, Melanie. So for folks who may not know, this event is being co-organized between the Climate Hub and the Black Student Union, so it's a really awesome collaboration. And a little bit more about myself. So my name is Adriana. I use she, her pronouns, and I work for the Climate Hub. And the Climate Hub has a bit of a hybrid model where we are student-led and youth-driven, but we are embedded within the UBC institution. So we are a part of UBC Sustainability Initiative. And our work is focused, we're also relatively new. We started up about 2 or 3 years ago. And our focus is really on climate justice, on systemic change, and on youth-driven hopeful movements. And we've got lots of different projects going on. We've got events, research projects, a lot of different programs. So feel free to check out our social media and our website if you want to know more about what we do. And I will pass it back to Melanie to tell us a little bit more about this event.
So this is not the first time we've had the privilege of working with Climate Hub. We did last February for our Black History Month, and we did an event surrounding environmental racism. So this issue of climate justice and policing, it's very complex. It's complex in the wording and also complex in the issues, but it's very relevant and very important. So in the past few years, we've seen the rise and the awareness on the climate crisis, and then also we've seen awareness being raised towards policing and the state violence. But both these issues have so many intersections and they're connected. So as the BSU and as the Climate Hub, and we're passionate about both of these topics, we wanted to organize an event that would allow people to understand and make a connection between these two topics. So I think Adriana now will kind of talk more into detail about what is the connection between climate justice and policing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And we're also super excited to have like an ongoing relationship with the BSU as well. It's great to collab with student clubs who have a similar vision, and it's great to work with people like that. So just for some additional context as to the event today, it's part of our annual Climate Solution Showcase, and the theme this year is climate justice, race, and intersectionality. So if you want to check out some of our upcoming events, some of which we also have with the BSU next semester, check out our social media. And we also want to give a shout out to the Pacific Institute of Climate Solutions for making this event possible. So as Melanie mentioned, there are lots of connections between climate justice and policing and state violence. We've seen time and time again how the police are actually used to oppress BIPOC-led movements throughout history, not just in the last year. This should come as no surprise when we see the history of the police and why the police and the RCMP were created in the first place. We've seen how the RCMP are mobilized to forcibly and violently remove Indigenous land and water defenders from their own land. We've also seen how the police are criminalizing Black and low-income communities, who are also the communities who are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And we've also seen huge amounts of public money allocated to policing. And we also know that in some cases, large fossil fuel companies are actually investing money in the police in North America. We also need to be really clear in our statement that we cannot approach the issues of climate justice or racial justice from the lens of an individual action perspective. We need radical systemic change. And now I know that we're all really excited to hear from our speakers directly, so I swear we'll stop talking very soon. Just so you know what the event flow is going to be like, we'll hear from our three amazing speakers for about half an hour, so 10 minutes each. And we'll be followed, after that we'll have a 15-minute facilitated Q&A with the whole group. And after that we will have one round of breakout rooms for 15 minutes, and we'll come back as a big group to hear key takeaways from our speakers and any calls to action they might have. So just so you all know, for today, we will be using Slido to monitor any questions you might have as they come up. So I will put the link in the chat right now. Please use this. Please refrain from using the chat to ask your questions. Please use Slido. So we're able to track the most popular questions and we don't lose sight of what you want to know more about. Just for context, when you do submit a question, please make sure to say for Udacam or for Sarah or for Celeste, or a general question for all three panelists, so we're able to have an idea of who you're trying to direct this question to. And I will lastly pass it off to, again, one last time to the BSU to introduce our amazing and brilliant speakers for today. So Melanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So like Adriana said, I have the privilege of being here with three amazing panelists. So Udacam will be speaking first, and her pronouns are she and hers. So she is a social justice activist and an aspiring transportation mobility justice engineer. She can be found engaging in discourse that reimagines a revolutionary future. And here in Vancouver, she is an organizer for the Black Lives Matter. We have Sarah Hunt, who is an activist, a scholar, a collaborator. She is passionate about creating alternates to violent state systems through nurturing community networks with shared orientations towards decolonization, self-determination, and solidarity. And she is an assistant professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Political Ecology in the School of Environmental Studies at the University of Victoria. So then lastly, we have Celeste, who is a queer Black community organizer and creative with roots in the Bahamas, China, and Haiti. So she is dedicated for fighting and deepening understanding of environmental and racial justice. And she is currently at the Ottawa Rise project coordinator at Apathy is Boring. So I'm gonna have the privilege of handing it over to Udacam, who's gonna be sharing her perspective on this topic. And so please.
Thank you so much, Adriana and Melanie, for having me here today. It's an honor to be speaking with all of you and also to be a part of this amazing panelist. So thank you. Before I go on, it's a grand experience for me to also acknowledge where I am calling you from today. I am on the unceded, stolen, ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, colonially known as Vancouver. Myself, I am an immigrant from Nigeria. I am of the Igbo people, so we're in the southeast of Nigeria, and I moved over to Canada and have been complicit in colonial systems now for about 12 and a half years. Yeah, so I like to make sure that I do that just as a way to situate myself and also kind of draw parallels in what I'm going to be talking about today. It's going to be kind of casual. That's what my energy is today. It's not going to be anything structured. So please go with me, hold space. And if I'm talking too fast, definitely put a comment in the chat box and someone will try and slow me down. We'll see how that works. But for today, I wanted to touch on my perspective around the ways that the police are used to enforce a lot of climate injustices and environmental injustices, the ways that they are used to oppress protests and uprisings around those injustices, and also the ways that the police and the systems around our justice systems and our carceral systems are also used to kind of suppress a lot of these movements and grassroots organizations. So when we talk about climate justice and policing and how they're used to enforce a lot of these extractive projects, we can think of the easiest example being Wet'suwet'en and the CGL, and how the RCMP are used to enforce that project, and like literally going against the rights of the Wet'suwet'en people to their land and to control access to their land and resources on their land. We see this happening in so many cases around the world, how armed forces and troops are being sent worldwide, especially to a lot of racialized countries and communities for the purposes of resource extraction. They're used to intimidate and make sure that these corporations and government bodies are able to access whatever resource that they need, which leads to land degradation and resource degradation. And then when we look at the ways that the police and policing institutions are used to oppress folks as they fight for their land and defend their land, again, we think of Wet'suwet'en, we think of the blockades, we think of the ways that the VPD here in Vancouver were used to disperse the blockades, arrest protesters, and basically create a way, not only were protesters arrested, but there was an injunction put on protesting and an injunction put on those arrested to not show up at any other protests as well. So this is a way that they use these systems to almost immobilize the movements and grassroots organizations. I also personally, from my lived experience, think of the Niger Delta in Nigeria and the ongoing oil spills that are currently happening and the ongoing fight that the communities in that area have against companies like Shell that use corrupt ways to enforce really detrimental practices and the oil spills that are causing a lot of inhumane conditions for people living in those communities. We look at the ways our police systems and justice systems are used to suppress people from even fighting for their rights. So let's say you take the company to court or you try to go the route to get justice. We see how a lot of these companies and use those same systems to suppress your ability to move forward in the justice systems using tactics that cause delays, tactics that frustrate people, that wear you out, that deplete whatever income it is that you have to fight for these injustices against yourself and your communities and your land. And there is, at first, when I started doing a lot of research into this and showing a lot of interest into climate justice and policing, I was like, wow, like we see this models everywhere around the world, and the way the systems of policing are very similar. Yes, they are similar because they are literally the same. The RCMP and the Nigerian police force, even the police force in South Africa, were all modeled from the Irish police force when the Irish were part of the United Kingdom. And so we see the same institutions that are modeled after this one source doing the same things in completely different parts of the world. However, the common factors in those parts of the world are racialized people. So we see Black people and racialized communities and racialized identities that are being put in harm's way, their resources extracted, and their lives being degraded and not, especially in the case in Nigeria and the Niger Delta, we see that a lot of the ways that Shell and other oil companies navigate the justice system there's a complete disregard for the justice system. There's a complete disregard for human life. And we see the same situation here in Canada, so-called Canada, where Indigenous people and land defenders, which is given their born right, their traditional ancestral right to protect the land, are also undergoing the same oppression and the same tactics of intimidation. And so when people talk about climate justice and environmental justice, and they don't talk about racial justice, or they don't talk about the intersections of one's racialized identity and lived identity, I can't even take it seriously. Like, we can talk about emissions all day, we can talk about going vegan, we can talk about recycling all till the cows come home, but if you don't start from the history of the land, the people, the folks that are very closely connected to these situations, folks that are put in harm's way, folks that are subjected to a lot of these climate changes and climate injustices, like folks in a lot of Indigenous communities that don't have access to clean water. Like, if you're not starting there, and if you're not looking for ways to address those injustices, you cannot be talking about climate justice. It just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. And so that's where my heart kind of landed today on this conversation with you all around the connections of the police systems, and also the connections to global environmental degradation, resource depletion, and overall grave human injustices to Black folks and Indigenous folks around the world, including Black Indigenous identities. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Udokam. It was amazing to hear your perspective, and for also bringing your perspective as a Nigerian person too. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today. Yeah, thank you for that. I also, on kind of a personal lens, kind of see that happening in my own country as well, in Central America, seeing how Canadian mining companies are just coming in, and the police and the military are actually used as a way to enforce that and actually give corporations more power than the people they're supposed to protect. So thank you for sharing that perspective with us today. Next up, I believe we have Sarah, so I will pass the mic to you.
Thank you so much. So good evening. I'm Sarah, or Tlali Tlila Ogwa. I'm Kwagyuth from the Kwakwaka'wakw people from Tahis, which is on the northern part of what's now called Vancouver Island. I'm also Tlingit from what's now known as Alaska, and I'm Ukrainian and English as well through my mom, who's a white settler here in these unceded territories. I'm speaking today here on the ancestral homelands of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, which are now called the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples. And want to acknowledge being a guest here, but also a relative to many of the families and communities here in these territories. I want to really just extend a huge thank you to the Black Student Union and the Climate Hub for the invitation to be part of this conversation, and also to Udokam and Celeste for this dialogue, and all of you for joining today. There's so much to say about this topic, so having 10 minutes is really, I feel like we could have a whole many days together. So I did make some notes just to keep myself focused. It's a scattered time of year for me. So so I'm just gonna start with that. So I really want to start, I guess, today by locating this conversation in the lands where we are, wherever you may be, but thinking in particular about the lands here on the coast and the waters, where both UBC is located and where I'm located just across the ocean over here on the lands of the Coast Salish peoples, so the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and then here the Lekwungen and Wasanich. The lands and waters here have sustained life in this place since time immemorial in ways that did not and do not rely on either carcerality and policing, nor extractive, exploitive relationships to the land, water, and air. These lands and waters hold knowledge of just ways of sustaining life and of living in relation with each other, which are premised on consensual, respectful practices of governing. The language of these lands and waters are full of teachings about justice, which have been nurtured for thousands and thousands of years. And Indigenous people here practice ways of solving problems, of addressing harm, and of intervening when something is out of balance, premised on a view of the world in which humans are not separate from land and water, but are relatives of the land and water. Indigenous peoples across the globe, of course, have for thousands of years developed sophisticated, distinct systems of law, governance, and justice, which have been and still are under assault by colonialism and imperialism, which we know are the systemic underpinnings of climate change. And this is important to remember, and kind of wanted to start with this because all too often the systemic violence of policing and the global violence of extractive relationships with land overshadow the resilience and persistence of these other ways of being which have always been here. In this sense, my starting point is that we don't necessarily need new approaches to justice when we talk about climate change. We need to remember forms of justice which are already here and which require attentiveness to unsettling and decolonizing approaches, and which foundationally require centering the voices of Indigenous peoples globally, including those who've been displaced and dispossessed by the forces of imperialism, racial capitalism, and environmental catastrophe. In envisioning what climate justice is and what movements for climate justice look like in practice, we need to think about whose voices are at the center. So for me, the vital point, I guess, in this conversation, as Udo Kam has already talked about, is that climate change and policing have the same systemic roots. Imperialism and colonialism, which are inherently structured through with racism, which is also capitalist, heteropatriarchal, and ableist. And we know, of course, that police were first introduced here in what's now called BC in order to enforce the laws of the newly created colonial governments, laws which were explicitly racialized in order to control the movement of Indigenous people, as well as migrants and indentured laborers. Indigenous people were deemed a violent threat to the order of the new settler colony, and police were created to keep Indigenous people onto newly created reserves and out of emergent settlements. So policing in this place we now call BC has always been a tool of the racially stratified settler state, intent on using land for specific purposes, those of settlers and of industry. In sites of state and industry contested Indigenous land defense, whether in Wet'suwet'en territories or at Standing Rock or other places around the world, we see police acting, as has already been talked about, as state agents to enforce government decisions to allow pipeline projects, dams, fracking, or other incursions. In these moments, it's easy to see how climate change is directly facilitated by the violent arrests and surveillance of Indigenous land defenders and their allies. But what may not be so evident are the everyday ways in which police facilitate state violence in the lives of Indigenous people globally, as well as Black people and other people of color whose vulnerability to police brutality is created by the same systems which comprise, again, the roots of climate change. Indigenous people and people of color around the world are unable to sustain themselves due to land theft, pollution of lands and waters, as well as rising sea levels, rising sea temperatures, hurricanes, and other kinds of supposedly natural disasters. This, along with systemic neglect and impoverishment, creates conditions of precarity that put Indigenous people and people of color around the world at the whim of police who have impunity to act in violent and deathly ways. So we often hear about the ways in which pipeline development is linked, for example, to man camps in northern BC, which leads to increased violence against Indigenous girls, women, and Two-Spirit and queer people, which the police systemically ignore. But in those same communities, police have historically also and continue to arrive with, for example, social workers to remove Indigenous kids from their homes. Police also surveil and harass Indigenous and other racialized people in those same communities, leading to huge overrepresentation of racialized and Indigenous people in jails across Canada today. And in these same communities, it's common for Indigenous people to be beaten by police or violently arrested, even when they themselves call for help. So there's just so many stories of, for example, young women being attacked and calling police and they themselves being arrested or seen as the problem. And these are forms of colonial violence carried out by police that rarely make it into the media, but are nonetheless an expression of the same racist imperialist roots, which again serve to diminish the value of land as a relation and instead to set up a whole society built on extractive relationships with land. And foundationally, it is the devaluation of the lives and lands of Indigenous peoples globally, fueled and bolstered by white supremacy. So climate justice really starts by looking at the systems of value, which depoliticize these everyday, intimate experiences of harm in the lives of Indigenous people globally, not just when thousands of girls and women and Two-Spirit and queer people go missing, or when people are angry about man camps related to pipeline development, or when a land defender is violently arrested or shot by police, but at the everyday level, when people can't feed their kids or don't have running water, and at the same time are being blamed for this precarity, and thus have cops showing up to take their kids away or cart them off to jail. And so for me, this requires kind of thinking across these kind of scales of the intimate and the global, thinking about the ways, for example, that keeping Indigenous kids in their homes, in their places of belonging across the globe is so vitally important for sustaining the knowledge of how we take care of the land and waters, how we revitalize ways of thinking about our relationships with the environment that is not premised on extractive relationships. So those are really interconnected, and because police are violent forces, both that intimate level of the home and also that level of land defense, it's important that we see and make those connections and politicize the work at both scales. So thank you.
Thank you. That was very, very generous of you to share with us. I think there's so much to unpack there, and I feel like I'll have to watch the recording 3-4 times to really think about everything that you said there. So thank you so much for that generosity. And to me, kind of something that really stood out that you said is not just thinking of policing as like direct physical violence, but also the many multiple ways that we police people within our world. And how you see that in everyday interactions, and how that's also so profoundly embedded in other institutions that aren't just the police or the RCMP. So truly thank you for highlighting that. Yeah, thank you for your generosity in sharing that with us. And next up, we have Celeste. So Celeste, I will pass the mic to you.
Thank you so much, and hi everyone. I'm so excited to be here. I get a little nervous when I have to public speak, so bear with me. And yes, also this topic is very large and many, many nuances and intersections that I want to speak to all of them, and definitely cannot within the 10 minutes. So I also have some notes to try to keep me grounded, and I'm a Sagittarius, so you'll see me going everywhere, but I'm gonna do my best to stay grounded. Yeah, I just wanted to also name that I'm calling in from unceded Algonquin territory, which is colonially known as Ottawa, Ontario. So I'm in a different time zone than I think most of you folks, but also naming that my ancestry is both rooted in the Bahamas. Both of my parents are from the Bahamas, my mom being Chinese, and my dad having roots in both Haiti and the Bahamas as well. So I'll speak to this later, but I think one of the symptoms of colonization is really this disconnection and this erasure of our ancestral histories and our knowingness. And I think that's also one of the ways that policing shows up, and almost in a quieter way, of the ways that we internalize these institutions and these systems and this erasure in our own lives, and we disconnect from our own knowledges and our own ways of being and hearing and connecting to each other in the land. So I want to name that, and also say that that's an ongoing process for me in deepening my own connection to my ancestry and my spirituality. And I think that's a really important aspect to finding liberation, both for myself, my communities, and also in healing the land that I currently occupy, which is not land that I'm indigenous to, but land that I have a responsibility to care for and to deepen my awareness of. Yeah, I think what both Sarah and Udokam named with kind of the roots of climate injustice is really what I wanted to hit on, and I'm really grateful for both of you really laying it out so that I don't have to do that again. But I think what I really want to drive home is this idea that there is like a creation of hierarchy when we think about who is rendered and what land and what people are rendered exposable and expendable. And you see that in the misuse and the exploitation of land, in the ways that we see land ownership and corporations and landowners using land in very inappropriate ways, in ways that center profit and the profitability of these lands and how much money we can extract from this land, as opposed to what Sarah, you beautifully named, this centering around the sacredness of space and what the land can offer us in terms of knowledge and wisdom, but also even just this consideration for the longevity of space and the longevity of communities and the land itself. I think that's really lost under racial capitalism and through legacies of environmental colonialism. We lose this idea of sustainability and reciprocity and giving back to spaces that give to us. It's a very linear relationship, a very extractive relationship. And I think with that, again, there is this rendering of certain spaces as disposable, as we are able to extract from certain spaces that we can destroy because, you know, there is a need to acquire profit and acquire wealth at disproportionate and unsustainable ways. So I think of that, and then I think of policing as a means to enforce these hierarchies of value, as a means to, you know, ensure that the status quo, this hoarding of power and this hoarding of wealth, can continue. Policing is a way to normalize and maintain this accumulation of wealth at disproportionate rates. And that also relates to, I think, racialized people, Black and Indigenous people, because when we think about the ways that racial capitalism affects the land, those same logics are used to destroy and exploit people of color. One of the realities of capitalism, of colonialism, is that there is a necessity of exploitation. There is no accumulation of wealth or you know, an accumulation of power without there being something to exploit, be it the land or people. And we see that in real time in the ways that, you know, essential workers or Black and Indigenous folks are being rendered poor, or in the ways that our labor is being exploited at disproportionate rates. Our lands and the communities that we live in are being gentrified, and we're being displaced at disproportionate rates. So again, I just want to drive that home, that when we think about economic justice, when we think about racial justice, when we think about environmental justice, we can name that, you know, we can't think about one without the other, but we need to understand why that is, and why we're attacking and we're dismantling systems of oppression that render certain people disposable. And in that process, thank you, 5 minutes. That's good to know. In that process, I think we also need to kind of go out of our way to recenter the land. And I say that as someone who also recognizes that within our ancestry and within our knowledges of ways of caring and being in relationship to the land, sometimes that's not recentering the land. It's more of just a focus. It's not like the land was ever decentered. That's an understanding that the land and our liberation is deeply tied. That was never, you know, not understood. But I think there's intentional logic and intentional narratives that are normalized by the police state, by our colonial state of Canada, that say that, you know, these things are separate. The way that the land is not centered in our liberation. I say that in a way to kind of bring attention to the ways that we have to kind of go out of our way to protect the land when we think about how we're addressing the police and racial capitalism. So I also want to, with the 5 minutes that I have left, because I think this connection has been really beautifully made, and what I want to speak to more deeply is really what is policing and climate justice have to do with this idea of reclaiming our knowledge and the ways that we care for each other. I think what was shocking, and this is from, you know, being in Ottawa just earlier this week, the police voted on, you know, a $13 million increase to the police budget, which was complete trash. And they had over 100 public delegates come to the meeting being like, this is not where we need these resources to go. There are people, we know how to take care of ourselves. We know how to take care of ourselves. And I think that's one of the symptoms of colonial violence, is this idea that we don't know how to take care of ourselves. And there's this internalization of this logic that we have as people of color, as Black people, and as Indigenous people. And I say Indigenous as, you know, Black folks are ancestrally Indigenous to land. We know what we need, and we often are asleep, and there's an intention in keeping us asleep to our own knowledges and our own ancestral wisdom. And that's, you know, deeply rooted in colonial violence, the ways that our knowledges have been stolen and displaced for centuries. And there is intention behind that. There's a destabilization when we're not rooted in our ancestry and connected to our spirit and to our ancestors, and also to the land. The land brings us so much wisdom in just understanding how we can care for ourselves as individuals and as beings of this earth. There's this spiritual aspect that white supremacy and white colonial culture doesn't consider when it's, you know, rendering certain spaces as, yeah, we need profit, but what is the sacredness? What is this land teaching us about how to be in relationship to each other? The trees, as they, you know, the leaves change in the fall, there's wisdom there, right? So I would name that, you know, the ways that our knowledges are erased and displaced is also part of this violence of policing. And I think when we think about what it's going to take to recover that, to liberate ourselves, I name that it's both fighting the institutions that are rendering us disposable, and it's also recognizing that we're never going, these systems, the system of policing was not created for me to survive. And that's a really tragic, and it makes you really angry, but that is the reality. And I am going to have to go out of my way to create the conditions for my well-being. And that means recovering and regrounding and recentering in my own knowledge and the ways that I intuitively know are good for me. There's this focus in white culture, white supremacist and white dominant culture, that's really centered on the written word. It has to be researchable, it has to be quantifiable, but there are certain things that we just know intuitively, and that is what is like going to take us to the next level. It's that deep intuitive feeling, that deep intuitive knowingness of what is good for us, that is going to liberate ourselves and allow for us to reintegrate values of care and of love and of well-being within our communities. And we're going to require resources and capacity to do that. And I welcome folks who don't share that ancestry to think about what it means to redistribute wealth and power in that way. But I am at time, and yeah, I appreciate this space, and just want to name that caring for ourselves and pouring love into ourselves and doing that healing work is part of this. It's absolutely part of this. And thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I always feel bad being the time person because there's just like so much brilliance that's just pouring our way, and I feel really bad interrupting y'all because I could listen to you speak all day. So thank you again so much for that. And I think kind of something that really stood out to me from what you said is we know how to take care of ourselves. Like, we know how to do this. We have been doing this for centuries before colonialism. We know how to do this. And it can be quite patronizing to be told that you don't, when you have generations to prove otherwise. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to all of our three speakers. Our Slido is going off right now with all questions for y'all. So we are ready to move into our Q&A. I'll start with the first one, and then I'll pass it off to Melanie to ask the next ones. So one question that we really wanted to ask all speakers for today is a pretty broad one. What are some alternatives to policing? How can we move towards or move back to systems of care and community care? What does that look like? So again, I know that is a very broad question, and we will never have enough time within this time frame to answer that with the depth required. But just going to open that up to our three speakers and see who would want to go first.
I can give it a try, my best shot. So there is an Indigenous community, I believe, in northern BC that successfully modeled like a community approach to policing. And I feel like that's one example of alternative ways of policing that we can look to. I don't have the reference on me right now, but I will definitely put it in the chat once I get a hold of it. There are models out there that have been tried, tested, and true that we can look to that are Indigenous-led, centered, created as alternatives to community care and policing. Now, as an activist myself, I am for police abolition and obviously for defunding the police. And so I think that the institution of policing as it exists needs to be completely thrown away. And what that looks like right now, I don't have a paper to hand over. I don't have a direct a plan and a flow chart to provide to you. But I know that once if we can dream it, we can come together and make it work. We need the appropriate resources, and we need everyone to come together to truly believe that this actually can happen and we can dream up a new way. What we don't need is increase in police budgets, and we don't need folks to continue to talk about reform and all of that stuff, because we've tried that, it does not work. But there are, as policing sits today, there are alternative methods that Indigenous communities around the world have come up with for their community and for their care that we can look to emulate in a way.
Thank you. Sarah, Celeste, if you have anything to add to that, please feel free.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of examples, I think for one, I think it's important to recognize that actually a lot of Indigenous communities, especially in BC, are very remote, and they don't rely on police to solve problems. So, you know, in communities where I've heard many times, if you call the police, it might take them a week to come, especially if it's something like a sexual assault or forms of violence they don't take seriously or don't care about. And so communities are already doing a lot of things that don't have police as the main, you know, police and justice are not necessarily seen as being related, other than potentially as related to injustice. So things, I think what I think about is really building up networks at an intimate level of people who have a shared language and understanding around needs. I think, you know, Celeste talked beautifully about care, ways of caring for each other, and that, you know, if you need help, that you have someone to call on. If you know, to be able to tell people, if something is happening to you, you can call me and I will come. And that I have networks of people I can call on to support me or to come and do this with me. So the more we can imagine other ways of dealing with when harm has happened, thinking about accountability, you know, all of those things, I think the more we grow that and build that language and capacity just within our own, you know, kind of networks and communities, then we're able to imagine that world without police more strongly, and to think about what that looks like. But I think that, yeah, there's a lot of different examples of ways that that's being done. But unfortunately, the various levels of government are also actively suppressing that. So, for example, here in Victoria, we just had, for example, people who are unhoused, and in Megan, which is also called Beacon Hill Park, that there are a number of people sleeping there because of the housing crisis that we have, and a group of people got together and made showers and built a community care kind of tent, and then the city brought, you know, dozens of police in to dismantle that and take that all down. So that's seeing how, even though the city says that they're contemplating alternatives to policing, they have a couple studies out. They're putting the money into the studies. They're also actively using the police, and, you know, in the name of policy, to try to dismantle community care, which is a alternative to state systems. So it is, it's important. I think that's why having that shared language and capacity and vision is so important, because we're constantly pushing back against the state, which is going to always try to suppress that. So that's settler colonialism for you, unfortunately.
Thank you. So Celeste, if you would like to share anything, but if not, we can move on to another question that we have from the side out, which is, what would you say to people who say that resource projects need to happen, especially since natural resources are used in renewable energy? So that's quite a deep question. I'll put it in the chat, but feel free to give it a minute of thought. Yeah, I can repeat it one more time. It says, what would you say to people who say that resource projects need to happen, especially since natural resources like metals are used in renewable energy?
I guess just my first response, just in brief, would be that there should not be any of those activities on Indigenous lands without free, prior, and informed consent, according to international legally agreed upon rights that Indigenous people have around the world. And so that would be the way that we get to answer that question about whether any of those should go ahead or not.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I think we have time for one more question, and I'm gonna go for the Slido to see if anything else. So one was, how do you fight against the immense emotional burden of feeling helpless when the systems perpetrating harm are so much bigger than us or as individuals, because we're so small compared to, I guess, the global world and these big institutions who have so much control. If any of you would like to share.
I can speak to that. And also to answer the first question, I'm really bad like on the spot, so I'm like, oh. The first question, it's just like something that one of my good friends Muna named is like the punitive system is really depersonalized, and that's not what we need. We need to really personalize our solutions to crime or to, you know, transforming relationships. And so I think it's really going to take some imagination and some dreaming at the local level that already exists. There's already brilliance and knowledge and ways of doing things. Again, it's just poorly resourced and not prioritized for very intentional reasons. So I just wanted to name that I think it's going to be very localized, and that's okay. And yeah, like different communities have different needs and different solutions. I think to answer the question of how to stay like hopeful and yeah, just keeping the faith, I think that's something I've been grappling with a lot lately, especially just thinking about this impending doom of, you know, the earth is holding a lot. And when you tie that to also the like spirit of the earth too, and thinking, you know, the earth can feel, not in like a human way, but still like there is grieving that is happening through all of the violence that is against people and against land. And then I also, on the flip side of that, what brings me a lot of joy is thinking that there's also a lot of love. And I know that's like a very naive kind of like statement, but when you think about how we can be in right relationship with the land, how we can be good for the land, there's this return of energy and this idea that the land can also feel when we're honestly and authentically connecting and building a relationship with it. And that's not something that can happen overnight. I can't just go to the park, which I did the other day, and just try to hug this tree and be like, I'm healed forever. No. Like, it's going to take me actually committing and doing the hard work, which it always is. It's hard unraveling and it's unlearning, and it's, you know, breaking cycles of trauma that have been in our family lines for generations. But it really starts by building those relationships with the land around us, and knowing that we can be good medicine for the land. Our laughter and our dancing and our singing, those are all ways that we can offer energy back into the land when it feels like, you know, where we're in this cycle that everything is so linear and there's no way to offer reciprocity. I would just offer that there are ways that we can pour into our healing, which us being joyful is also healing the land, and I want to offer that. And also this idea of kind of tapping back into our practices and our ancestry. I think there's real value in recovering and reclaiming what is ours and what has always been ours. And when I say what is ours and what has always been ours, I'm talking about like those $10 freshie juices and like those $20 Buddha bowls that, you know, are like, those are our recipes. Those are our like ways of taking care of our bodies and using the earth to sustain us. It's just been gentrified and sold back to us in like ridiculous prices. Yoga teacher training should not be $3,000, but here we are. So I think there's real tangible ways to connect to different practices and ways of being in connection to the land and to spirit that maybe feel good for you. If that's yoga, if that's getting into herbal, trying out different teas, experimenting with different foods and seeing how that reacts in your body and how you can be in connection to land in that way. It doesn't have to be a big transformative shedding. It's really those smaller steps that I think are really important in getting us connected to our bodies, so that we know, you know, how to take care of ourselves, and that's the healing work, so that we can, you know, exude that love to other people and to the land. So those are some of the steps that I've been trying to practice, but it's hard work, it's life's work, and remembering that is also important.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Definitely. It's definitely an eye-opener in the sense of the point you raised in regards to like the Buddha bowls and the smoothies and everything, taking herbal medicines that, you know, this is like historical practices and indigenous practices, but they're now, like you said, being gentrified and used and I guess sold again, privatized from, I guess, the history and the linear cycle, like you said. But I think it's almost time for the breakout rooms.
We have time for one more question because
One
we're
more
still
question?
setting them
Okay,
up, but we'll have the breakout rooms in about 5 minutes.
Perfect. That's fine. So I think with that question, it kind of perfectly ties into what there's a question right here. It says, why do you think the barriers of entry are so high when it comes to impacting change? And kind of talk about the sense of why is it so hard for change to happen, or why it's such a long process or prolonged system, I guess, if any of you can speak on that.
I'm going to give that a go as well, but also everything Celeste said around taking care of oneself. That was really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Personally, I've experienced it being so difficult in cultivating change or even shifting the dial, because a lot of these issues that we talked about are systemic and they're deep rooted. And sometimes some of these systems and institutions just have to go. We waste a lot of time in reform or trying this, taking that course, hiring diverse folks, all of that stuff, when really it's the tree is rotten at the root. Like you need to uproot it. You need to take it out. I saw recently someone posted, if that tree is continuously yielding bad apples, then there's something wrong, and you cannot continue to feed into it. And that's one of the big reasons I would say it takes so long to enact change. Also, the ways that white supremacy and the white supremacist world works is there are a lot of barriers in place, and these barriers look like bureaucracy, or just barriers look like people in place that are actually delaying the progress of justice and the work that a lot of activists and grassroots organizations and advocates are trying to do. Yeah, that would be the two big reasons I would say that a lot of these delays are happening, and why it's taking forever, it seems.
Thank you.
Can I just add, or just in agreement, I think just racism is so, if we think about like, why did it take thousands of Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people going missing before it became an issue? Or, we see around police brutality, why does it take thousands of Black people being killed by police? Like the scale at which that violence has to happen in order to matter, to start movements. Like there have been movements happening around all of these issues, including the way that people are being displaced because of climate change or are unable to sustain their communities because of climate change. People have been speaking out about it. It's just that people haven't been listening. And that I think is because of racism. Like these movements have been led by racialized people who, not to call out Greta Thunberg, but why is it that someone listens to this white child, and yet there's, people of color have been talking about these same things for many, many, many years. So I think we need to really look at racism as a core issue, problem as well, or barrier.
Yeah, definitely. Like you said before, and like we said so many times, climate justice and racial justice are so interconnected and so important. And like, I feel like sometimes people look at it from two different, I guess, telescopes or two different perspectives, when we should be looking at them at joint and together, and how we can combat both. But yeah, Adriana, I'm kind of just gauging with you here.
Yes, so I believe that we should be ready for breakout rooms. Nafisa, thumbs up on your end. Nafisa is our amazing tech moderator, by the way. So big shout out to Nafisa for setting up the breakout rooms in the background. Yeah, I think we're ready. All right, so we'll be in breakout rooms for about 15 minutes. We'll come back at 6:20. At 6:20, we will hear again from our amazing speakers for some action items and key takeaways. So yeah, I will see my breakout room in a second, and I'll see you all in about 15 minutes.
All right, it should move us now. So 3, 2, 1, bye.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hi.
Fancy being in the same breakout room as you. Awesome.
Hello.
Hi. So thank you all so much for being here. I'll be the facilitator for today for this breakout room, and Urukam is our amazing guest speaker. So we'll be asking her some questions that we have one prepared, and then we'll be taking them from the Slido. So Urukam, I have a quick question for you before we get started with questions from the audience. Something that I've been thinking about a lot, as you may know. How can the Black Lives Matter movement and the climate movement stand in solidarity with each other and actually strengthen each other's work? So again, I know it's a very broad, big question, but throw that one out there for you.
That's a great question. And with some of these questions, I may take a longer than usual time to pause. One being that I love awkward silences, but also two, I just want to think about the question that you've asked. Also, hi, David. Lovely to see your face. That's a great question. I think my presence here is one of the ways that we are trying to show those connections and show that these systems of oppression kind of work to uphold each other. If we look at the concept as intersectionality, we see that these are all the systems that are working together against racialized folks. Or you can rephrase that and say racialized people feel the impact of these systems of oppression twofold or threefold or fourfold in disproportionate amounts. And Black Lives Matter, while a lot of the focus is on racial justice, there is an opportunity for us to, like the Vancouver chapter does, be in solidarity with Indigenous folks. A lot of the Black Lives Matter work is on Turtle Island, and a lot of it is unceded land. And I feel like once we connect and make a strong connection with Indigenous organizers, Indigenous communities, it's such a huge leap into like climate justice and environmental justice as well, because a lot of the fight and a lot of the struggle has been about land and is about land, and the use of it, the degradation of it, the displacement of people, and natural systems and ecosystems. And so I feel that that is one of the big ways that Black Lives Matter as a movement, as an entity, can really connect itself to the climate justice movement.
Thank you so much. I know I kind of put you on the spot there.
Okay.
But thank you for that brilliant answer. Honestly, I think your point on needing to have that kind of intersectional lens is so important, not just with climate movement, not just with Black Lives Matter, with everything we do. That needs to be a central pillar to everything, because that's how people experience the world. And that's, as a reflection, should be how we approach it. So thank you so much for that. There's another question from the Slido that I think is really interesting to ask you. And it's, what can we do in Canada to support folks in Nigeria fighting against companies like Shell that are often actually based in North America?
That's a great question. And not to mess with your order here, Adriana, but because we're in such a small group, if folks want to ask their question, unmute themselves, I want to encourage that kind of interaction as well. I'm sometimes uncomfortable talking at people, so I want to hear your voices if you're feeling up to it. But regard to the question, that's a great one, because who here heard about NSARS? You can just show a thumbs up or raise your hand if you heard about NSARS. Yeah, okay. And the reasons that you heard about NSARS is because a lot of Nigerians in the diaspora shared about NSARS. They tweeted about NSARS. It was on your social media. You heard about NSARS because a Nigerian shared about NSARS. And I think that that's the power of being in diaspora and having that connection to home. I think that a lot more Nigerians and a lot more folks in the diaspora need to be tuned in as well, and they need to be sharing and boosting a lot of what's happening there, because the changes that we're seeing happening and the attention that atrocity got was because of pressure from international bodies and because of pressure from basically the whole world turned on Nigeria. And that's why a lot of change happened. And we saw that even now with a lot of the justice systems in the States. When the riots happened, the public shared it, boosted it. We all turned our attention over there, and that's what created change. So I think that we need to really examine the content you're consuming. If your life and goal and mandate is climate justice, how global is your social media? How global is your the content that you're consuming and the people that you're following online, the books you're reading, the folks you're referencing? Like, what's your reach in that sense? And if it's just in North America or just in Turtle Island, then perhaps you need to re-examine that and figure out, why isn't my reach global, especially given that a lot of these resource extraction projects are benefiting folks that live here, are for folks that live here, at the detriment of Black Indigenous people in their own countries and on their own land. And I think that curiosity is the best gift that we can have. The more we get curious about these things and the more we seek answers to them, the better. So it honestly starts with what you consume, the news you consume, the media you consume, the books you read, the podcasts you're listening to, and boost them, talk about them, bring them up at dinner. Yes, be that person that ruins the conversation at dinner, bring it up. I've ruined many a dinners.
I also see a question from Claire in the chat. So Claire, do you want to ask that?
Absolutely. From my living room in my pajamas, I will ask you. If you kind of already answered it, but if you wanted to build on it, I just asked, in the current COVID climate where everything has shifted to like what you consume online, how does one amplify if they don't have social media accounts?
That's a very good question. The radio is still very much a thing. You can call into your radio channels. You can continue to pester them until they talk about it on their channels. You can write to your MPs. You can say, hey, did you know that this is happening in Nigeria and Shell is the oil's coming here? Like all of that stuff. Like, you can definitely draw parallels to some of the issues that you see and see who it concerns and write to them. It's hard to not think digitally, especially because our whole world right now is on the internet, as I am meeting all of you for the first time virtually. But I know that it is possible to still engage and still spread the word via like things like the radio, via I don't know what other means folks are using if they're not using social media, but even email, I don't know if you use an email, with an email list, you can definitely do that. I was thinking about starting up my own personal newsletter and having folks, my friends sign up my newsletter, and I'll just send them things in your email that's like all the hot trending topics right now, and it's like a quarterly newsletter, and it just all links to things that you can click on. So that's also another way, if that's a project that you can take up and do that. But I definitely see the struggle between not being on social media, and also wanting to spread awareness. You just have to get creative on that front.
Awesome. Yeah, that is definitely a great question. I would sign up for that. I put in the chat hashtag hot takes by Udacam. That'd be great. If you want to start that up, let me know. I also definitely, please do let me know about that. I also see a question from Arisha. Do you want to ask that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for this event. It's quite awesome to see everyone come together and talk about these interesting and yet in this trying times. I'll just repeat the question. Can someone speak to the intersection of technology, surveillance, and policing towards BIPOC and minority groups such as Muslims? So basically how they use technology to do surveillance against those communities and targets them specifically. Yeah.
That's a very good question, and definitely, in all transparency, not one that I am prepared to answer in depth right now. However, I do know that with everything being so digital, that is one of the detriments to having a digital world is we're constantly being surveilled, either by our maps or pictures taken of us, posted on social media, location, all of that stuff. And I know that it's being used a lot of the times to arrest people or to target people that were at protests, to follow them home. Folks that if a picture was taken at you at a protest, you're more likely to be stopped by police for a random questioning and stuff like that. So I know that it's used to harass folks in communities that have been forced to margins and communities that have been deprived of resources, because those are the communities that are often found at a lot of these protests, blockades, and are the ones that are always calling for change and demanding change, and most likely demanding for police abolition. And in that sense, I have seen it take that I've seen it take shape in that way. And so one of the things that we do as activists is not to share, not to like tag anyone that someone was present at a protest or something, or share pictures or images from rallies and direct actions as a way to protect people's identities, especially when they're racialized identities, because the disproportionate impacts are just, they're compounding. That's my best answer for that for today, but I definitely think it's something that needs to be talked about, or perhaps a different conversation, its own Zoom around technology surveillance and its impact on racialized communities, for sure.
Yeah,
Thank
definitely.
you.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I just wanted to say thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add on that and say that there actually was an event specifically on police surveillance on BIPOC communities in reference to land defense. It was put on by Amnesty International and the BC Civil Liberties Association. I can't find the Zoom link, or it's on YouTube somewhere. I know it exists and I know it's open and recorded. So I would, if you're interested in that, I would definitely recommend checking that out. Also realizing we have about 3 minutes left, and I see a question from Daniel, so I want to pass the floor to you.
Yeah, I just had a question about like what you think like the risks or possible outcomes of abolishing the police are. Just because like I sometimes kind of struggle with that idea as something happening like now or very soon, just because I'm trying to think of like what would ways be to prevent things like murder, assault, or robberies. And I understand that like a lot of that is kind of the social conditions that have been created that lead people to prevent crime. But I kind of just wrestle with the idea of abolishing the police, say, like in the next couple years or so, like something like that, just because of, I don't know, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, that's a very common fear. That's why a lot of people are still hesitant on the whole abolish police or defund police movement. That's why a lot of folks still call for reform. It's like, oh, they're good guys. However, I will say that exactly what you said, a lot of social conditions cause people to commit crimes. A lot of social conditions push people to actually do those things. And I would argue that once resources are reallocated to those communities and reallocated to create opportunities for people to not just survive but thrive, reallocated to create opportunities for people to openly talk about their mental health conditions free from stigma. And the minute we are able to distribute wealth and distribute those resources, we will see a decline in these crimes that the police are so-called, are quote unquote preventing. I would also argue that the police do not prevent crimes. They actually just show up after the crime has been committed. So their presence already does nothing in terms of preventing the crimes that are being committed. So their presence is more punitive than anything else. And it's more to feed the carceral system. which then leads me to the conversations around transformative justice and police abolition, where we can talk about we need to first abolish the police that lives within us before we can actually do anything to abolish the police that lives in our communities. So once we can reimagine a transformative way of justice, we will see that there's no need for that.
Seconds to let everyone back into the breakout room or back into the main room from their breakout rooms. Hopefully it was very engaging and you got a chance to ask questions or hear more from one of our amazing panelists. And I'm handing it over to Adriana.
Yeah, I was in the breakout room with Udacam, and she was just right in the middle of going off on transformative justice, and there's just so much to say about that. So this to me is just like a wake-up call on the need for more events like this. So potentially stay tuned for some future ones, because there is so much to say about these topics.
Yeah, I had the privilege of being one with Sarah, and she was just about to get into it, and I had to be the person that was like, we have a minute left. So I wish we could extend it longer, but no, it was good.
Yeah, thank you so much to honestly, like, our speakers are just absolutely incredible. The questions that folks asked were absolutely incredible. So I'm truly just like really inspired by you all today. So again, I just really want to like big shout out to our speakers for being so generous and so brilliant, and for sharing their knowledge and their experience and their wisdom with us today. An hour and a half simply does not cut it. So thank you for doing what you could to kind of keep it to that. Really appreciative of that. And like I said, I want to make sure to give our speakers a last say. So each one will have about 2 to 3 minutes to share some key takeaways and potential action items that they see coming from this. So I'll pass the mic to Celeste. You've got a couple minutes to kind of say what's on your mind. What are some key takeaways?
Yes, hello. Yeah, I have a lot of things on my heart and my mind. I think one of the takeaways that I'm holding is just this need for imagination, and knowing that we're not at a lack of knowledge or the solutions that we hope and that we need to transform our societies exist. We just need capacity and space to do that. One of my friends, Rosie, actually named really powerfully in a conversation we were having that trauma kills imagination. And the fact that we don't have the space, the time, the energy to dream together is very much intentional and by design. And it's our responsibility, I think, to go out of our way to keep the hope and to dream, and also forgive ourselves for the ways that our spirits and our hearts also like may not have the energy to commit to that always, all day, 24/7. So I think that's kind of what's sitting with me. And also just this need to really center it on like the personal and at a community level. I had a quote by Audre Lorde that was showing up everywhere before this talk, so I was like, maybe I need to share this. But it says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Audre Lorde. And again, like, we cannot wait for systems or individuals who benefit off of our oppression to liberate us. That's not going to happen, and we need to go out of our way to create and dream the world that we deserve, and create the conditions that we need to be well. And knowing that in that process, we deeply need to consider what that means for our communities, but also the land that we're on, not only our ancestral lands that we might have a connection to, but as folks who may have been displaced or settled here, we also have a responsibility to listen to folks who have knowledge and who have been listening to this land. And it's also our responsibility to learn how to listen to our surroundings and be in true relationship with our surroundings. So I think those are some of the reflections that I'm having. I also want to uplift the I think there's a national call for action from Indigenous land defenders all across Canada. I want to uplift the moose moratorium folks who are fighting for a moose moratorium up just 2 hours north of Ottawa in Kittakinzibi, who have done some really beautiful work around hunting season, some really hard, tough work defending their camp and hunting grounds. So if folks are available and have heard about the national call for Indigenous and Black solidarity, and I think it's mostly Indigenous land defenders who are leading it, and there's been some actions that are in solidarity with Black lives as well. But check that out in your cities, and also want to uplift folks who are fighting for status, full immigration status for migrant workers, and also noting that is, one way that our government kind of renders certain people like it's kind of like institutionalized like oppression, like literally not offering a pathway to status is rendering folks precarious, and not protecting folks who are deeply in relationship to the land and who are working the land. So for folks who are following Harvesting Freedom or who want to learn more, Harvesting Freedom does some really great work around immigration rights for folks who are temporary and seasonal agricultural workers, and there's some campaigns right now around full immigration status for all. So I want to uplift that work and also name that that's deeply connected to climate justice as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's definitely a lot of calls to action there. And actually, if the speakers want, they can send me any links for more information or resources, and I can send that back to the Eventbrite. So people will have access to that. Next up is Sarah. Do you have any key takeaways or calls to action?
I think Celeste said most things I was thinking of, so I'm grateful for that. Yeah, I mean, that's everything that was said is so important. I think I guess one thing I would just say is that, efforts to take care of the land and waters are happening everywhere, not just the ones that get media attention or are visible on social media. And I'm always surprised, I guess, to see how there can be kind of an upsurge. We saw this around the No DAPL, the stuff in Standing Rock, for example. Like, there was such a mobilization, and then when a local event would happen, I think, where are those same people who are so active on social media? So I think paying attention again to where you are and local struggles. I know in my own territories that we have, the stuff around getting rid of fish farms has been going on just for decades, and it's so, the threat to wild salmon is just so vital to what it means to be from this coast and on this coast, and the health of the oceans matters to everybody. But because it's not really politicized in the same way as other struggles, it doesn't get the same attention, or people don't show up for events. So I think just to notice, what you can support where you are, not just the ones that are highly visible. Of course, with the pandemic, maybe that's constrained a bit, but there's lots of ways to do that. That doesn't mean leaving your house. I would also say to listen to youth. There's a lot of really incredible youth-led movements. I'm thinking of, there's a report on a website that's called landbodydefense.org. That has a report and a toolkit that was created by, I think, the Women's Environment Network and the Native Youth Sexual Health Network a few years ago. And it's an incredible resource that, just as an example of the ways that, particularly in this case, Indigenous youth, girls and women and queer and two-spirit people are really making connections between interpersonal violence and violence against the land, and then what kind of justice looks like and the healing work that's being done by those same people. And yeah, just to really echo what Celeste already said, I would say, to think about ways that you can change the way that we think about the way that land is treated and the way that land is acted upon in an extractive way, to change that by thinking about how we can listen to the land, how we can introduce ourselves to the land where we are, to really feel that, within Indigenous philosophies, that land is alive and has agency and is a living entity. within our teachings, you know, the same spirit that animates the land animates us. And so to think about how we are already connected, even if we, you know, have that severed in the way in our worldview, in a Western worldview. And so to think about the everyday ways that we can, you know, decolonization is so deeply embedded in the English language, or colonization is deeply embedded in the English language and worldview. And so, you know, those everyday ways we can rupture that by relating differently to the land. So yeah, Gila Kasla, thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And final say, Urakam, any key takeaways, action items that you want to leave us with before we wrap up?
Beautifully stated, Celeste and Sarah, thank you so much. A big thank you also to everyone here for being here with us. Some of my big takeaways are, first of all, we have a lot of work, and it's going to be a very long journey to abolishing the police in us first, before we can actually dream up and imagine a more sustainable way of abolishing the police that exists in outside of us. And this also looks like unlearning colonial ways of being. And so we do really need to focus in on the ways that our minds have been taught to be carceral, punitive, and the ways that we've been taught to navigate and engage with each other in a very violent and demeaning way. The second takeaway from me is going beyond the land acknowledgement. So yes, you are on stolen, unceded land. Now, what are you going to do about it? What are your responsibilities? How are you going to step into your power and your privilege to undo a lot of the colonial structures that you are complicit in? Because how else did you get here? And I'm excluding Black folks that were brought here on enslavement, because that kind of history is one that is not the same as folks that are settlers here or immigrated here on these lands. And so what does that look like in terms of resource allocation from your home, from your pocket, from your parents, from your family, from your work, from your communities? What does that look like in terms of showing up for solidarity actions, amplifying these voices, creating safe, inclusive workspaces? And so we really do need to go beyond a land acknowledgement and live every day like we are grateful to be on unceded land, and we are doing that work to unpack and dismantle colonial structures and systems. And then the last thing that came to mind was rest. Rest is resistance, and it's one of the ways that I've been taking care of myself throughout my work here with Black Lives Matter and in my working community. Please rest, take a break, unplug. That's gonna rejuvenate and revive you to go back into the work with a full cup. Part of the system, part of the work and the goal of oppression is to deplete you, frustrate you, exhaust you, displace you. And so we really need to resist in every way possible. And one of the greatest forms of resistance is rest. And with that, I just want to say thank you again to everyone for sharing today. I learned so much from every single person here. And I am so grateful to be a part of this conversation and to have met most of you virtually for the first time.
Thank you very much for sharing that. That was very important. I feel like we often just want to take so many actions. We also have to remember to take a break now to rejuvenate, like you said. But I want to say thank you once again to our amazing speakers. It's been a privilege to be here and be involved in this event, to hear from you guys. And like Celeste mentioned, I feel like inspiration is a big thing that funds like our thoughts and our opinions and our perspectives and kind of the movement forward. So I feel like I definitely am filled with that afterwards. Please, for everyone who's here, please get in touch with the speakers. I'm sure they would love to hear from you, any further questions or anything like that. And then also keep an eye out, because BSU and Climate Hub will be working together in next term. We're hoping to do an event on climate justice and food justice in the Black community. So that should be engaging and good. But yes, once again, thank you all for coming out. Thank you for being engaging. Thank you for spending time. And we hope that, you know, you got to take something away, but there is also a Google form that you can fill out that I think Adriana linked in just for some feedback. So please fill it out if you have the time. But yeah, thank you so much for everyone. Anything from you, Adriana, or?
I'm just in awe of everything that was said. I am still processing. So thank you so much. The recording will be available next week. I will send it over to folks. And if speakers want to send in any other resources, I will also put that in there.
Yeah.
So thank you all so much for coming. Just so much gratitude to everyone. Thank you so much. I hope you have an amazing evening. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.